The grand dining hall of the Harmony's light glowed with soft blue lights that made everything look peaceful and calm. And representatives from 12 different alien species sat around a curved table that stretched across the entire room, sharing food and stories as part of the Galactic Council's annual cultural exchange. Conference Vera Tolshan sat near the center of the table where she could see everyone clearly, and her silver skin reflected the gentle lighting as she listened to the conversations around her, with a small smile on her face that suggested she found most of what she heard to be amusing rather than interesting. She was a Zelkari, a member of one of the oldest species in the known galaxy, and her people had abandoned violence so many generations ago that they no longer even had words for many complicated concepts. And this made Vayara feel superior to the younger species who still celebrated their warrior traditions. Her tall frame and elegant silver robes marked her as a historian of high standing, and she had spent her entire career studying the cultures of other species and writing detailed analyses that were read throughout the galaxy. Though many of those analyses were not particularly kind to the species she studied, across the table sat two humans who had been assigned to the diplomatic mission, and Vayara watched them with the same curiosity a scientist might show when observing primitive creatures in their natural habitat. Lieutenant Daniel Carter was a quiet man in his early 30s with short, brown hair and calm gray eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. And he wore a formal military dress uniform that looked slightly uncomfortable on his average-sized frame. And he spent most of the dinner listening rather than speaking. Amy Shelton sat beside him, a woman in her late 20s with red hair pulled back in a professional style, and she served as the human cultural liaison officer who had spent years working alongside alien species and defending humanity's reputation at gatherings exactly like this one. Conversation eventually turned to the topic of warrior traditions, as it often did when multiple species gathered together, and the Norvian delegate began sharing stories of his people's ancient battles with pride in his deep voice. Vayara listened with growing impatience until she finally raised her hand to speak, and the table fell quiet because everyone knew that when a Zelkari historian wished to share her thoughts, those thoughts were usually sharp and memorable. I find it fascinating, Vayara began, her voice carrying the melodic tones of her species, how younger races cling to their violent histories as though they are something to celebrate rather than something to overcome. And I have studied the warrior myths of many species, but none are quite as exaggerated as those of the humans. She turned her silver eyes toward Daniel and Amy, and her smile widened slightly as she continued speaking. I have read your legends of soldiers who fight through mortal wounds as though pain does not exist, of warriors who sacrifice themselves for complete strangers, of single fighters holding positions against armies. I might say that while these stories are entertaining, they are obviously fiction designed to make your species appear more formidable than biology would allow. Amy's face tightened with controlled anger, but before she could respond, Vayara raised her hand again. Please, do not misunderstand me, as I intend no offense, but the Zelkari are scientists above all else, and we cannot accept stories that violate basic biological principles. And the idea that a single human could stand against dozens of enemies, bleeding from multiple wounds yet refusing to fall, is simply not possible for any carbon-based life form. She laughed softly, and several other delegates joined her, though some of them looked uncomfortable. Your species calls this state battle rage or adrenaline response. Yes, and you claim it allows humans to ignore injuries that would incapacitate any other species. But I have studied human biology extensively, and while your endurance is admirable for a species from such a harsh world, these legends stretch credibility far beyond the breaking point. Daniel continued eating his meal as though Vayara had not spoken at all, his expression unchanged. his attention seemingly focused entirely on the food in front of. Hinmei could not stay silent any longer and leaned forward with fire in her eyes. Those legends are based on documented historical events, she said firmly, and I could provide you with thousands of verified accounts from human history where soldiers did exactly what you describe as impossible. Vayara waved her silver hand dismissively, her long fingers catching the light. Of course, you would defend your own mythology, as all species do, but the Zelkari learned long ago that evolution favors cooperation over conflict, and species that cling to violent traditions eventually destroy themselves. And perhaps humans would benefit from accepting this truth rather than glorifying behaviors that belong in your primitive past. The other delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because the tension between the Zelkari historian and the human liaison had become thick enough to feel Daniel finally looked up from his meal, and his gray eyes met Vayara's silver ones for just a moment before he returned his attention to his plate without saying a single word. Vayara found his silence strange and somewhat unsettling, though she would never admit it, and she had expected the human soldier to defend his species with passionate arguments or angry denials. But his complete lack of reaction made her feel as though she had missed something important. Amy placed her hand on Daniel's arm briefly, before addressing Vayara again with forced calmness in her voice. Perhaps one day you will have the opportunity to see for yourself what human warriors are capable of, and on that day, I hope you remember this conversation. Vayara smiled with the confidence of someone who believed she would never be proven wrong. I sincerely doubt that such an opportunity will ever arise on a peaceful diplomatic vessel like this one, but I appreciate your optimism. The words had barely left her mouth when a harsh alarm began blaring throughout the ship, and the blue lights flickered to red as an automated voice announced that hostile vessels had been detected and that all passengers should proceed to their emergency stations immediately. Vaya's smile faded as chaos erupted around the table, and she looked toward the humans with sudden uncertainty, only to find Daniel already standing, his calm expression unchanged despite the screaming alarms. Something cold settled in her stomach as she watched him, and for the first time since the conversation began, she wondered if perhaps she had underestimated something important about the quiet human soldier who had not bothered to argue with her. Answer to that question was about to become terrifyingly clear. The red emergency lights cast harsh shadows across the dining hall as delegates from 12 species scrambled in panic, and the ship shuddered violently as something struck the hull with enough force to send several smaller aliens tumbling to the floor. Vaya gripped the edge of the table to steady herself while her silver skin seemed to pale with fear, and the calm confidence she had displayed just moments ago had vanished completely as the reality of danger replaced the safety of academic debate. Captain Zelen's voice came through the ship's communication system, his Zelkari accent thick with stress as he explained that Krovath raiders had disabled their engines and shields, and that multiple boarding parties were cutting through the hull at different points around the vessel. Krovath, Amy whispered with horror in her voice, and she turned to Vayara with an expression that mixed fear with grim determination. Krovath were known throughout the galaxy as the most brutal pirate faction in existence, and they stood over 7 feet tall, with natural armor plating covering their bodies like living shields. And their reputation for violence was legendary, even among species that celebrated warrior traditions. Vehar had studied them from the safety of her research archives, but she had never expected to encounter them in person, and the academic distance that had allowed her to analyze their culture without emotion now crumbled as the sound of cutting torches echoed through the corridors. The ship's small security team reported through the communication system that they were overwhelmed at multiple breach points, and their voices carried the unmistakable sound of people who knew they were about to die. Captain Zelen made an announcement that sent ice through Vayara's veins. "We will surrender to prevent unnecessary bloodshed," he declared in the calm tone that Zelkari used when facing inevitable defeat, "and resistance will only result in more deaths. So all crew and passengers are ordered to comply with the raiders' demands." Vayara nodded in agreement because this was the logical choice and the Zelkari way. And fighting against superior forces was senseless when surrender might save lives. And she looked around the dining hall, expecting everyone else to accept this wisdom. Her silver eyes found Daniel Carter, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The human had removed his formal jacket and retrieved a combat kit from somewhere nearby, and he was checking weapons and equipment with the same calm expression he had worn throughout dinner, as though preparing for battle was no different than choosing which fork to use. "What are you doing?" Vayara asked with disbelief coloring her voice. Daniel did not look up from his preparations as he answered in a steady tone. "The delegates need to reach the escape pods on Deck 7, and I am going to keep the main corridor clear so they can get there safely." Amy moved to his side and placed her hand on his arm with worry in her eyes. "Daniel, you cannot do this alone, and the Krova send dozens of warriors on raids like this." He finally looked up and met her gaze with gray eyes that held something Vayara could not identify. Something that seemed both peaceful and terrifying at the same time. "Get the delegates to the pods, Amy. And do not wait for me." Vayara stepped forward with her silver hands raised in a gesture of reason. "This is foolish beyond measure," she said firmly. "And one human cannot stop a Krovath raiding party, no matter what your legends claim. And you will die for nothing if you attempt this." Daniel finished his preparations and stood straight. And for the first time, Vayara noticed how different he looked now compared to the quiet man who had sat through dinner without speaking. And there was something in his posture that reminded her of predators she had seen in nature documentaries about dangerous worlds. "The legends you mocked were written by people who survived because someone like me stood between them and death," he said quietly. "And I am not asking for your approval or your belief, but only for you to get the delegates to safety while I buy you time." He walked toward the door without waiting for a response, moving toward the sounds of screaming and weapons fire that echoed from somewhere deeper in the ship. Vayara watched him go with her mouth open in shock, and she turned to Amy with desperation in her voice. "Stop him," she demanded, "because he's going to throw his life away for nothing." And this is exactly the kind of pointless heroism that I was talking about earlier. Amy's expression hardened into something Vayara had never seen on a human face before, and her voice carried an edge that cut through the chaos around them. "That man has fought in wars you cannot imagine, and he has saved lives in situations far worse than this. And if he says he can hold the corridor, then he will hold it until his body physically cannot move anymore." She grabbed Vayara's arm and began pulling her toward the exit that led to the escape pods. "You wanted to see what human warriors really are, and now you will get your chance, because the security feeds are still active, and you can watch exactly what your primitive mythology looks like in action." The group of delegates followed Amy through the corridors with fear driving their steps, and Vayara found herself unable to look away from the display screens they passed, each one showing different camera feeds from throughout the ship. On one screen, she saw Daniel enter the main corridor just as the first Krovath warriors came around the corner. And what happened next would haunt her memories forever. The peaks do massive armored aliens expected to find frightened diplomats begging for mercy. But instead, they found a single human standing in their path with weapons ready and absolutely no fear visible on his face. The first Krovath raised his blade to strike, and Daniel Vayara stopped walking as she stared at the screen. and Amy had to pull her forward as the sounds of combat exploded through the ship's speakers. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that everything she believed about humans was about to change. The security monitor showed everything in sharp detail, and Vayara stood frozen in the corridor as she watched. The human engaged the Krovath boarding party with movements that her mind struggled to process. The first 3 raiders had come around the corner expecting easy prey, and they had found death instead. Daniel moved with brutal efficiency that seemed impossible for a species the Zelkari considered primitive, and he used the narrow corridor to his advantage by preventing the larger Krovath from surrounding him or attacking from multiple angles. Vayara's silver eyes widened as she watched him take down the first raider with a strike so fast she barely saw it happen. And before the massive alien body hit the floor, Daniel had already engaged the second warrior. "We need to keep moving," Amy urged from beside her. But Vayara could not look away from the screen. The Zelkari had no words for what she was witnessing because her species had abandoned violence so long ago that they had lost the concepts needed to describe combat at this level. And she found herself inventing terms in her mind as she watched a Krovath blade cut across Daniel's shoulder and drew a line of red blood that spread across his uniform. And Vayara gasped with the certainty that the wound would stop him. It did not stop him. He did not even pause as he continued fighting with the same deadly precision. And the blood flowed freely, but his movements remained sharp and controlled. That wound should incapacitate him, Vayara whispered with confusion and growing horror in her voice. And any Zelkari would enter shock from such an injury. Amy kept her hand on Vayara's arm as she guided the group forward while watching the screen. Herself, humans evolved as persistence, predators on one of the most dangerous planets in the galaxy, she explained in a low voice. And our bodies can continue functioning through damage that would shut down most other species. And what you are seeing is called an adrenaline response. On the screen, another Krovath strike caught Daniel's leg, and he stumbled briefly before adapting his stance and continuing to fight as though the wound meant nothing. Vayara thought of the legends she had mocked at dinner. The stories of human soldiers fighting through mortal injuries as if pain did not exist. And she felt a cold realization spreading through her chest. The legends were not exaggerated. She breathed. "No," Amy confirmed grimly. They were not. More raiders poured into the corridor as word spread through the Krovath ranks that a single defender was holding the passage. And they came with fury in their eyes and blades ready to cut this human down. Daniel fell back slowly, giving ground one step at a time while maintaining control of the choke point. And Vayara watched as bodies began to pile up in the narrow space, each fallen Krovath becoming an obstacle that their comrades had to climb over. His uniform was soaked with blood now, some of it his own and much of it belonging to his enemies. And his movements had become slower, but no less deadly. A young Krovath warrior came around the corner and stopped suddenly at the sight before him. And Vayara could see the fear in his alien eyes as he stared at the human who stood among the bodies of his fallen comrades. Daniel had a clear opening to strike, and the young raider was completely vulnerable. And Vayara expected the human to kill him without hesitation. Instead, Daniel paused. He looked at the young Krovath with something in his gray eyes that Vayara did not understand. And then he tilted his head slightly toward the direction the raider had come from. Young alien understood the message and turned to flee, running back through the breach and leaving the battle behind. Vayara could not believe what she had just witnessed. Why would he show mercy, she demanded, when that raider would have killed him without hesitation if given the chance? Amy's voice carried a weight that made Vayara look away from the screen for the first time. "Human warriors choose when to kill," she said quietly. "And that is what separates them from monsters." And that young Krovath was afraid and probably following orders he did not believe in. On the screen, Daniel engaged the next wave of attackers, and his movements were becoming visibly slower as the blood loss took its toll. He knew he could afford mercy in that moment. Amy continued, because showing mercy did not put anyone else at risk. And true warriors understand that killing should always be a choice rather than an instinct. Viara watched as Daniel took another wound. This time, a deep cut across his side that made her wince even though she was watching from safety. And he pressed his hand against the injury briefly before raising his weapons again. How is he still standing? She asked with genuine bewilderment, because the people he is protecting have not reached safety yet, Amy replied simply. And his body will not stop until his mission is complete, or until it physically cannot function anymore. The other delegates had gathered around the monitor as well, and species who had been enemies in ancient times now stood together watching a single human hold the line against overwhelming odds. A Norvian warrior who had shared stories of his own people's battles whispered something in his native tongue that sounded like a prayer. Viara finally allowed Amy to guide her away from the screen, but she kept looking back as they moved toward the escape pods, and the image of Daniel standing blood-soaked among his fallen enemies burned itself into her memory. She had spent her entire career studying warrior cultures from the safe distance of academic research, and she had dismissed their traditions as primitive and their legends as fantasy. Now she understood that she had been studying shadows without ever seeing the fire that cast them. The sound of continued fighting echoed through the corridors behind them, and Viara realized that every second they moved closer to safety was a second that Daniel Carter bought with his blood. The escape pods were just ahead, and Amy was helping the delegates board as quickly as possible. But Viara could not stop herself from returning to a monitor station in the corridor to watch what was happening. To the human who had made their escape possible, the screen showed Daniel still standing in the blood-soaked corridor. Though standing was perhaps too generous a word for what he was doing now. He leaned against the wall with one hand pressed to his wounded side while the other gripped his blade, and his breathing was visible even through the grainy security footage. Each breath coming harder than the one before. 11 Krovath bodies lay scattered around him, and the floor was slick with blood that caught the emergency lights and turned everything red. Viara had counted the wounds she could see on his body, and by every measure of biology she understood he should have collapsed long ago. A new figure appeared at the end of the corridor, and Viara felt her silver blood run cold as she recognized the markings of a Krovath. War leader Gorvak was massive, even by the standards of his species, standing nearly 8 feet tall with scars covering his armored hide that spoke of countless battles survived. And he moved with the confidence of a predator who had never met prey that could challenge him. He stopped when he saw the carnage in the corridor, and his heavy footsteps echoed as he walked slowly past the bodies of his fallen warriors. Vera watched his face on the monitor and saw something she did not expect. Respect. Gawk stopped several feet from Daniel and studied the wounded human with eyes that held none of the rage she would have expected from a war leader whose warriors had been slaughtered. You have fought well, human, Gorvak rumbled in a voice that the ship's translation system converted to words Viara could understand. And I have led raids across 100 worlds, and have never seen a single defender hold against so many of my warriors. Daniel straightened slowly, pushing himself away from the wall with visible effort, and he raised his blade despite the trembling in his arms. The delegates have not reached the pods yet, he said quietly. So I am not done. Gorvak tilted his scarred head with what might have been curiosity. You can barely stand, and your blood paints the floor beneath your feet. And yet you speak of continuing to fight. Daniel's gray eyes met the war leader's gaze without flinching. The capacity to fight is not measured by how much blood remains in my body, but by how much fight remains in my heart." Gorvak was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. "I offer you a warrior's death, human, quick and honorable, because you have earned that much through your courage today." Daniel adjusted his grip on his blade, and Vayara saw something change in his expression, something that made her lean closer to the monitor, even though every instinct told her to look away. "I appreciate the offer," Daniel replied, "but I have people counting on me to buy them time, and I cannot accept death until they are safe." He raised his weapon and moved forward. Gorvak roared and charged to meet him, and the impact of their clash echoed through the ship's corridors. Like thunder, Vera watched with her hands pressed against the monitor screen as the two warriors fought in the narrow passage. And she knew immediately that this fight was different from the others. Gorvak was larger and stronger and completely uninjured, and he wielded a massive blade that could cut through ship hull with ease. Daniel was bleeding from more than a dozen wounds and could barely lift his arms. And by every logical measure, he should have died in the first exchange. But he did not die. Instead, he did something that made Vayara finally understand what human warriors truly were. He traded wound for wound when Gorvak struck at his chest. Daniel did not try to block or dodge, but instead stepped into the blow and delivered a strike of his own, accepting the injury in exchange for landing one on his enemy when Gorvak's blade cut across his arm. Daniel used the moment of contact to drive his own weapon into a gap in the war leader's armor. It was a form of combat that no sane species would ever attempt, a willingness to accept destruction in order to deliver it. And Vayara finally understood why the Zelkari had abandoned violence so completely. Her species could never fight like this because they valued their own survival too highly. But humans had evolved on a world so dangerous that survival instinct alone was not enough. And they had developed something else. Instead, the willingness to die for others. Amy appeared beside Vayara and tried to pull her toward the escape pods. "We need to go now," she urged. Vayara shook her head and kept her eyes on the screen. "He's not fighting to survive," she whispered as understanding finally bloomed in her mind. "Because he already knows he's going to die." Amy's voice cracked slightly as she confirmed what Vayara had realized. "No, he is not fighting to survive, because he is fighting to give us every possible second to escape." And his own death became acceptable the moment he decided to stand between us and the raiders. On the screen, Daniel and Gorvak exchanged a final series of blows, each one devastating, each one bringing both warriors closer to their end. Gorvak brought his massive blade down in a strike meant to split Daniel in half. And Daniel did not try to avoid it. Instead, he stepped forward into the blow and drove his own blade up through the gap beneath Gorvak's chin with every remaining ounce of strength in his body. Both warriors fell. Gorvak collapsed backward with Daniel's blade buried in his skull. Dead before he hit the ground, Daniel crumpled to his knees beside his fallen enemy, his hands still gripping his weapon, even as blood poured from the terrible wound across his chest. Vayara watched him fall, and something inside her chest broke. The legends were understated, she breathed, and no story could capture what I just witnessed. Amy grabbed her arm with desperate strength. "The pods are launching, and we have to go right now." But Vayara was already running in the wrong direction, moving toward the corridor where Daniel had fallen, unable to explain why she could not let the human who had saved them all die alone among his enemies. Vayara ran through the blood-soaked corridors with her silver robes flying behind her, and Amy's shouts for her to stop faded into the distance as she followed the path of destruction that Daniel had carved through the Krovath raiding party. She did not understand why she was running toward danger instead of away from it. But something deep inside her demanded that she reach the human before death claimed him. Corridor was worse than the security footage had shown. Bodies lay everywhere, Massive Krovath warriors who had terrorized 100 worlds now reduced to still forms on the blood-painted floor. And Viara had to step carefully to avoid slipping as she made her way through the carnage. She found Daniel slumped against the wall at the end of the passage, his hands still wrapped around the hilt of his blade. Even though he no longer had the strength to lift it, Gorvak's body lay nearby, a monument to the final battle between two warriors who had given everything they had. Viara dropped to her knees beside Daniel, and her silver hands pressed against the terrible wound across his chest. Without any thought for the blood that stained her elegant robes, "Help is coming," she said desperately, though she had no idea if that was true. "So you need to hold on." Daniel's gray eyes opened slowly, and he looked up at her with an expression that seemed almost peaceful despite the pain that must have been consuming him. Did the delegates make it to the pods? He asked in a voice barely louder than a water whisper. Vera nodded quickly, as tears she did not know she could. Produce began streaming down her silver cheeks. "Yes. They launched just before I came back for you. And everyone is safe because of what you did." Something that might have been a smile crossed Daniel's bloodless lips. "Good," he breathed. "That is good." His eyes began to close, and Viara shook him gently with fear gripping her heart. "No. You cannot die here. Not after everything you did. Not when I finally understand." She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Amy kneeling beside her, the human woman's face wet with tears as she pressed her own hands against Daniel's wounds. "A human patrol ship received our distress signal," Amy said quickly, "and their medical team is on the way right now." The next few minutes stretched into an eternity as Viara and Amy worked together to keep pressure on Daniel's wounds. And Viara found herself praying to gods she did not believe in for the human to survive. When the rescue team finally arrived, they moved with an efficiency that reminded Viara of Daniel's combat movements, each person knowing exactly what to do without needing instructions. They rushed Daniel to emergency surgery aboard their ship, and Viara was left standing in the blood-soaked corridor with Amy beside her, both of them covered in red and silver, and waiting to learn if their efforts had been enough. 3 days later, Viara stood outside the medical bay aboard the human vessel, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to face the man whose sacrifice had shattered everything she thought. She knew Amy had told her that Daniel was conscious and recovering, though the doctors said his survival was nothing short of miraculous, even by human standards. Vera entered the room and found Daniel propped up in a medical bed, his body wrapped in bandages and connected to machines that beeped softly with each heartbeat. He looked smaller, somehow without his weapons and his mission. Just a tired man in a hospital bed who had nearly died protecting strangers. "Historian Talshin," he said with a slight nod. "I did not expect to see you again." Viara approached his bed slowly and stood at the foot of it for a long moment before she found the words she needed to say. "I was wrong," she admitted quietly, "about everything I said at the dinner, about human warriors and their legends, about violence being a sign of primitive evolution, about all of it." Daniel watched her with those calm gray eyes that no longer seemed ordinary to her. "You were not entirely wrong," he replied gently, "because most humans will never fight like I did. And they will live peaceful lives and raise families and create beautiful things without ever needing to access the part of themselves that I used in that corridor." He shifted slightly in the bed, wincing at the pain the movement caused. But when someone we have sworn to protect is in danger, something wakes up inside us. Something old and powerful that comes from thousands of generations of ancestors who survived because they were willing to fight for each other. Viara moved to stand beside his bed and looked down at him with new understanding in her silver eyes. "I need to ask you something that I cannot stop thinking about," she said carefully, "because during the battle you showed mercy to a young Krovath raider who would have killed you without hesitation." Daniel nodded slowly, I remember him. Why did you spare him when you killed all the others? Daniel was quiet for a moment before answering. He was afraid. And I could see in his eyes that he was not a warrior by choice, but by circumstance. And killing him would not have protected anyone because he was already running away. He met Vayara's gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. Human warriors are not killing machines that destroy everything in our path. And the ability to choose when to kill and when to show mercy is what makes us warriors rather than monsters. Vayara felt tears threatening to fall again as the full weight of his words settled over her. I spent my entire career dismissing your species as primitive because you had not evolved beyond violence, she confessed. But I understand now that what you have is not violence. It is something much more complex. Daniel almost smiled. The capacity for great violence and the wisdom to use it only when necessary. That is what separates protectors from predators. Vayara returned to her ship later that day and sat in her quarters for hours, staring at a blank screen as she considered everything she had witnessed when she finally began writing. The words flowed from her fingers like water released from a dam, and she wrote a new historical analysis that would become the most important work of her career. She titled it simply A Correction, and it began with the words that had been echoing in her mind since she knelt beside a dying warrior in a blood-soaked corridor. I ridiculed the legends of human warriors because I could not imagine any species capable of what those stories described. But I have now witnessed the truth with my own eyes, and I must share it with the galaxy. She wrote about Daniel and his sacrifice, about the mercy he showed even in the midst of battle, about the way he accepted his own death as an acceptable price for protecting strangers, and she ended with a warning that she hoped would reach every species. In the known galaxy, the legends of human warriors are not mythology meant to frighten more evolved species, and they are not primitive exaggerations born from the need to appear formidable, because they are documentation of a species whose capacity for both violence and mercy makes them unique among all the stars. Her final line read, "Do not make the mistake I made by dismissing these legends as fantasy, because they are not stories to be mocked but warnings to be heeded. And any who threaten what humans love will learn this truth the way I did, through blood and fire and the terrible beauty of a single warrior standing against impossible odds." She sent the document to every archive in the galaxy and then sat back in her chair with a deep breath. Somewhere across the stars, Daniel Carter was recovering from wounds that should have killed him, and Vayara hoped that one day she could thank him properly for teaching her the most important lesson of her long career. The legends were real. They had always been real, and the galaxy would do well to remember that